The sun was falling, slow and molten, bleeding orange into the long, flat horizon. Elias Boone shifted in the saddle, his hips aching from the ride back from the cattle market in Santa Fe. The wind that had been biting all morning had gone still, leaving the air thick and restless like the pause before a dust storm. The desert stretched on all sides open, indifferent, endless. Elias knew this stretch of road well. 23 miles between the town's last clapboard storefront and the rutted path that turned toward his ranch. 23 miles of nothing but cactus, dry gulches, and the occasional crow circling a carcass. Most men found it lonely. Elias preferred the silence. It didn't ask questions. It didn't remember things you'd rather forget. His horse. A buckskin mare named Juniper moved steady but slow, her tail flicking at flies. The market had been a waste of a trip, prices low, buyers stingy, and everyone talking more about a coming drought than business. Elias had sold only 3 head, barely enough to justify the ride. But the truth was, he hadn't gone to town for profit. He'd gone because the walls of his empty ranch house were starting to feel like they were leaning in on him. Once, years ago, there had been laughter there. A woman humming in the kitchen. A boy chasing a puppy across the yard. The sound of water sloshing in the washtub. All gone now, taken by a fever that came quick and left nothing but graves under a twisted juniper tree. People said Elias had never been the same after. Maybe they were right. He guided Juniper off the main road toward a shortcut through the edge of town, where the desert met the scatter of buildings like a reluctant handshake. This was the part of town most folks pretended not to see: weathered shacks, broken fences, children with bare feet and hard eyes. It was where the wind pushed the dust and the people the rest of town didn't want to claim. As he passed the old grain warehouse, the sound hit him first, a sharp, ugly crack like wood splitting, then a muffled cry. Elias slowed the mare, ears straining. There it was again, a voice raised in anger, a second voice, weaker, pleading. He turned down a narrow alley between the warehouse and the back wall of the general store. The air smelled of stale beer and rotting fruit from the bins out back. In the half-shadow stood a man Elias recognized from town, Tom Beringer, a broad-shouldered ranch hand with a reputation for a quick temper and a slower wit. In front of him, pressed against the wall, was a woman. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, dust clinging to her skin. Tom's hand came down again, hard enough to make the woman's head jerk sideways. She didn't scream this time. She just stood there, one arm curled protectively around 3 small girls who huddled against her legs. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8. The youngest clung to her mother's skirt, eyes wide as coins. "You useless thing," Tom was snarling, voice thick with drink. 3 girls. What good are you to me? You can't even. Elias didn't let him finish. His boots hit the ground before Juniper had even stopped. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying in the still air. Tom spun around, surprise flashing in his red-rimmed eyes. "Ain't your concern, Boone?" Elias took a slow step forward, his gaze locked on the man, not the woman, not the children. "It is now." Tom squared his shoulders, trying to make himself bigger. "You don't know what she's done." "I know what you're doing," Elias said, "and you're going to stop." There was a long, brittle moment where neither man moved. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. A dog barked. Dust drifted between them like smoke. Finally, Tom spat into the dirt, muttered something Elias didn't bother to catch, and shoved past him toward the mouth of the alley. The girls flinched as he passed, but he didn't spare them a glance. When his boots faded into the noise of the street, Elias turned toward the woman. Up close, she looked even smaller than he'd thought. Her cheek was swelling, her lip split, but her eyes dark and steady met his without flinching. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer. Her grip on the children only tightened. Elias felt something shift in the quiet between them, though he couldn't have named it yet. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this ride home was about to be different than he'd planned. The woman didn't speak, but Elias could read the truth in her posture. She was braced for more blows, not from him, but from whatever came next. He'd seen it before in horses beaten past trust, in dogs that flinched at the shadow of a hand. The kind of damage that wasn't always visible, but never truly healed. The three girls clung to her like small, wind-tossed saplings trying to root themselves in a storm. The oldest thin and bony with sharp cheekbones that made her look older. Then she was kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on Elias with a mixture of suspicion and hope. The middle child, maybe 5, had the kind of wide, soft eyes that could make a grown man forget to breathe. Now they were rimmed in red from crying. The youngest hid her face entirely, pressing it into the folds of her mother's skirt as if to disappear. From somewhere up the street, laughter rang out, men leaving the saloon, unaware or uncaring of what had happened just around the corner. Elias glanced that way, then back at the woman. "You need a doctor?" he asked, her lips pressed tighter. She shook her head, just once. "Where do you live?" Another pause, and this time her answer was little more than a whisper, "With him." Elias didn't have to ask who him was. Tom Beringer had a small shack on the edge of the poor quarter, no fence, no garden, just a roof barely holding the rain out. He'd also heard rumors that Tom had been spending more nights in the saloon than at home. If that was true, the beatings probably came in bunches, fueled by whiskey and frustration. He was about to say something else when Tom reappeared. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other men, fellow ranch hands, one tall and narrow-eyed, the other broad and soft around the middle, had joined him. The 3 moved in together, blocking the far end of the alley. Tom's lip curled into a sneer. "Thought you could just walk away from this, Boone?" Elias didn't move from where he stood, but his hand rested lightly on the butt of the revolver at his hip. "Not interested in a fight, Tom." "Then step aside," Tom said. "She's my wife." "My property." The word property made something cold uncoil in Elias's chest. He'd heard men talk about women that way before. In the war, in the mining camps. It never failed to scrape against him like grit in a wound. "She's not going anywhere with you tonight," Elias said, the tall man laughed. "Or what? You gonna shoot us right here in the alley?" Elias didn't answer. Sometimes silence was more dangerous than words. For a moment, it seemed the standoff might snap. The men's boots scuffed in the dirt. A fly buzzed near Tom's ear. The woman had gone perfectly still, though Elias noticed her hand pressing. The girls behind her, farther into the shadow of the wall. Then, the broad man muttered something to Tom too low for Elias to catch. Tom spat into the dust again, but this time he took a step back. "This ain't over," he said, pointing a thick finger at Elias. "You don't know what you're messing with." Elias held his gaze until they turned and walked off, disappearing into the muddled glow of the saloon lights. The sound of their voices faded into the din of laughter and the sharp clink of bottles. The woman let out a breath she hadn't seemed to realize she was holding. The girls didn't move. "Come on," Elias said finally, keeping his voice low, even. "You can't stay here." She hesitated, glancing toward the street where her husband had gone. There was no softness in her eyes, just a raw calculation of someone deciding which danger was worse. "I've got a place outside town," he continued. "Quiet, safe." "You don't even know me," she said. "Don't need to," he replied. "I know him. And I know you've got 3 kids who can't sleep in an alley." Her gaze slid to her daughters. The oldest gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. The middle child reached for Elias's hand before thinking better of it. Elias offered his hand to the mother instead. She stared at it for a long time, then placed hers in his. Her skin was rough, dry from work but warm. "Come on," he said again, this time more gently. "Let's get you out of here." The four of them stepped into the dark, away from the noise of the saloon and the men who'd claimed her. Elias didn't know yet where this would lead, but the decision was made. Somewhere in the silence between their steps, something had already changed. The street was nearly empty when they stepped out of the alley, but Elias knew enough about men like Tom Barringer to understand he wouldn't be letting things go. Pride could make a man foolish. Whiskey could make him reckless. The combination was dangerous enough to get people killed. He led them toward Juniper, who waited tied to a hitching post near the freight depot. The Mare flicked her ears at the sight of strangers but didn't shy. Elias mounted first, then reached down to lift the smallest girl into the saddle before him. The other two climbed up behind their mother with an awkward scramble. It wasn't. Comfortable Juniper wasn't built for four riders, but they didn't have the luxury of comfort. They had just turned toward the edge of town when he heard it, the unmistakable scuff of boots following with purpose. He didn't have to look to know who it was. "Boone?" Tom's voice carried sharp in the still night air. Elias stopped the Mare but didn't turn her. "Keep your eyes forward," he murmured to the woman. She obeyed, but her grip on her daughters tightened. Tom came into view, flanked by the same. Two men as before. They weren't hurrying, but their stride had that deliberate, slow-rolling menace meant to intimidate. One of them, the tall one, had his hand resting on the handle of a knife tucked into his belt. "You think you can just ride off with another man's wife?" Tom's words slurred at the edges, but his voice was loud enough to turn heads from the saloon porch. A couple of men wandered out to watch, leaning against posts with that idle curiosity townsfolk always had for trouble that didn't belong to them. "She's not yours tonight," Elias said evenly. "Not after what I saw." "What you saw is between a man and his wife," Tom shot back. "Ain't your place to meddle." Elias swung his leg over and dropped to the ground, the small girl sliding down into her mother's lap. He took a few slow steps forward until he stood halfway between Juniper and Tom. The dust between them was pale under the moonlight, scuffed with the prints of their boots. "This is where you stop," Elias said. The tall man smirked. "Or what?" Elias didn't raise his voice. "Or you cross this line," he drew the tip of his boot through the dust, a faint scraping sound, "and you find out." Tom's jaw worked like he was chewing on the choice. He looked at Elias, then at the Mare, then at the woman. The saloon door creaked again, and another pair of onlookers stepped outside. There were rules in a place like this, unspoken but understood. One of them was that if you backed a man into a corner in front of witnesses, you'd better be ready for the fight that followed. The broad man shifted his weight. "Tom, maybe we shut up," Tom snapped. The air went heavy. Elias didn't move. His revolver stayed in its holster, but the way his hand rested on it left no doubt about how quickly it could be drawn. Tom took one step forward, grinding his boot over the line in the dust. Elias's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "That's far enough." Something in the tone, not loud, but certain, made Tom hesitate. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint jingle of Juniper's bridle as she shifted. Then Tom spat a wet slap into the dirt and stepped back over the line. "You're making a mistake, Boone," he said. "Been told that before," Elias replied. Tom jerked his head at his friends, and they turned away, disappearing into the glow of the saloon like shadows folding back into darkness. Elias didn't watch them go. He turned, mounted, and nudged Juniper forward. The woman didn't speak, but he could feel her gaze on him, as though she was weighing every word and action, deciding whether she'd traded one kind of danger for another. As they rode out of town, the saloon noise faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the sage. Elias kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind stayed on the line he'd drawn in the dust and the knowledge that Tom Beringer wasn't the kind of man to forget a public humiliation. They rode in silence for the first mile outside of town, the moon casting a silver path over the dirt road. Behind them, the faint glow of lamplight from the saloon thinned and then vanished. Only the creak of the saddle leather and the occasional sigh of the mare broke the quiet. Elias could feel the tension in the woman behind him like a drawn bowstring. Even with the girls pressed between them, she sat straight, ready to spring away if she had to. He'd seen that posture before, wild colts ready to bolt, half-starved strays deciding whether to bite the hand that reached for them. "Where are we going?" she asked at last, her voice low but steady. "My place," Elias said. "It's a long ride, but it's safe." "Safe," she repeated, as if testing the word for truth. "Safer than with him," he said, as her arms tightened around her youngest. "We don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Elias said. "It's a ride out of trouble." She was quiet a moment, then asked, "And after the ride?" Elias didn't answer right away. The truth was, he hadn't thought past the next hour. He only knew that the idea of leaving her and the girls in that alley, of sending them back to a man like Tom Beringer, was something his conscience wouldn't allow. Finally, he said, "After the ride, you can decide if you stay. But tonight, you're coming with me." The words came out more like an order than an offer, and for a heartbeat he regretted how they sounded. But then he thought of the look in Tom's eyes, the way his hand had landed on her face in front of her children. Some choices weren't polite. They were necessary. "You don't know me," she said again. "I know enough," Elias replied. "I know you didn't deserve what I saw, and I know you've got 3 girls who deserve better." That last part made her fall silent. Elias could feel the change, not trust, not yet, but the edge of something softer. Maybe she hadn't heard many men speak of her daughters that way. They rode on, leaving the main road to follow a narrower trail through the sagebrush. The night air smelled faintly of dust and juniper, cool against their skin. Above them, the stars came out in hard, bright clusters. After a while, the oldest girl spoke for the first time. "What's your horse's name?" "Juniper," Elias said. "Like the tree?" "That's right." The girl nodded, as if filing that away for later. They rode another stretch before the woman spoke again, her voice quieter now. "I'm Mara." Elias nodded. "Elias Boone." She didn't say anything else, but the exchange felt like a small bridge between them, a thin plank, laid over deep water. By the time they reached the first low hills that marked the edge of his land, the moon was high. The mare's hooves clinked against stones hidden in the dirt, and the girls had slumped against their mother, half asleep. Mara's arms stayed wrapped around them, protective even in exhaustion. Elias slowed the mare to a walk. "There's a barn up ahead," he said. "We'll rest there a bit before heading to the house." Mara didn't answer, but she didn't protest either. The barn was old but sturdy, smelling of hay and warm wood. Elias helped the girls down first, lifting them gently so as not to wake them fully. Then he turned to Mara. She slid from the saddle. Without taking his hand, but he didn't take offense. Inside, he spread a blanket in the corner near a stack of hay bales. The girls curled together, their breathing evening out within minutes. Mara stayed standing, arms crossed. "You mean to tell me," she said quietly, "you're just going to let us stay in your barn and ride off in the morning?" Elias met her gaze. "I mean to tell you you're welcome to stay as long as you need, but either way, you're not going back to him." Her eyes narrowed as if searching for a catch. "And if I said no?" "Then I'd still ride you out of town and make sure he doesn't touch you again," Elias said. "But I'd be lying if I said I'd let you walk off alone." Mara's expression softened, but only a fraction. She glanced toward her daughters, then back at him. Why? Elias shrugged, though the truth was heavy in his chest. Because I've buried enough people I cared about. Don't plan on adding you to that list. For the first time, her gaze faltered. She lowered herself onto the blanket beside her children. Elias stepped toward the barn doors and pulled them closed against the wind. The night outside was vast, but in here, the air felt warmer. He sat down across from them, back to the wall, revolver within easy reach. Mara didn't say thank you. Elias didn't expect her to. Some debts weren't settled with words. The next evening, they left the barn behind and took to the open land. Elias had given Juniper a long rest, fed her oats, and checked her hooves. He'd also saddled his second horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Bramble, so Mara could ride with. Her two older girls while Elias carried the youngest. The sun dropped behind the far hills as they set out, the horizon painted in bruised purples and deep gold. Soon, the sky darkened until it was nothing but a black canvas scattered with stars sharp, countless, and so bright they seemed to hum. Elias kept them off the main trail, following winding cattle tracks and dry creek beds that cut through the sage. We'll make better time this way, he said, but the truth was, he didn't want Tom or anyone else finding them easy to track. Mara rode a little behind him, her posture careful but not rigid. The girls sat quiet at first, worn out from the day, but the middle one eventually began pointing out constellations she thought she recognized. Elias listened with half an ear, more focused on the sounds of the night, the shuffle of hooves in the dust, the rustle of something small moving in the grass, the low, distant call of a coyote. After an hour, the youngest girl stirred in Elias's arms. Is it far? She asked, her voice drowsy. Not too far now, he said. You just keep your eyes on the stars. I can't see 'em from here, she murmured, her head tucked under his chin. He adjusted her gently so she could. Lean back and look up. Her small gasp of wonder was almost too quiet to hear. Behind them, Mara's voice broke the stillness. They're beautiful, aren't they? The middle girl nodded against her mother's side. There's so many. More than we could ever count, Mara said softly. The trail curved around a low ridge, revealing the open sweep of the high prairie. Out here, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, though the ground was still dry and cracked. Juniper's ears twitched, and Elias glanced west. No storm yet, but clouds were building low over the mountains. They stopped near a dry wash to water the horses from a small canteen. Elias offered Mara a drink, but she hesitated. You first, she said. I've got another flask, Elias replied, handing it over. Don't argue. She took a sip, then passed it to the oldest girl. The water was warm, but none of them complained. As they rode on, the conversation between the girls drifted into soft, half-sleep murmurs. Elias didn't speak, but his mind kept turning over the day before. He'd drawn a line in the dust with Tom Beringer, but lines only meant something if you stood ready to defend them. Tom had the kind of temper that chewed on an insult until it turned into revenge. The thought made him scan the darkness behind them more than once. He saw nothing but the long stretch of road fading into the hills. Still, he kept his hand close to the revolver at his hip. An hour before midnight, they reached the rise that overlooked his ranch. From here, the land rolled gently down into a wide basin, scattered with sage and wild grass. In the moonlight, the low shapes of the barn and house looked almost like a mirage, small, solitary, but rooted deep in the land. That's it? Mara asked, her voice unreadable. That's home, Elias said. They descended the slope slowly, careful not to spook the horses on the loose stones. The quiet here was different from the quiet in Townless Hollow, more alive. Somewhere out in the dark, an owl called Dot at the barn. Elias helped the girls down first. They were too sleepy to protest when he carried them inside and laid them on a bed of fresh hay. Mara followed, her eyes scanning the shadows as if she were trying to measure the place for danger. "You'll be safe here," Elias said, leaning against the stall door. "Safe for how long?" she asked. "As long as you need," he answered. "And maybe longer." Mara didn't reply, but when she looked at her girls curled together under a blanket, something in her shoulders eased, just a little. That night, they didn't light a lamp. Instead, the moonlight spilled through the barn slats in silver stripes, falling over them as they slept. Elias stayed awake on a hay bale near the door, revolver within reach, listening to the slow breathing of 4 people who didn't yet belong to him, but who he already felt responsible for. Above the barn roof, the stars burned on, sharp and cold, like the watchful eyes of something ancient. Morning came slowly on the high prairie, the kind of light that seeped in pale and cold before the sun climbed the hills. Elias was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with a tin mug of coffee, when the first thin line of gold split the horizon. The ranch house sat quiet behind him, its cedar boards weathered to a silvery gray. The wind carried the smell of dew on sage, though the ground itself was as dry as old bone. He'd lived here alone for 6 years. 6 years of tending cattle, mending fences, and talking to no one but his horses and the occasional ranch hand he hired for branding season. The place had always been too big for one man, but he'd never thought to change that. Filling it again would mean admitting it was empty. The sound of small feet on the porch boards made him turn. The oldest girl, hair tangled, eyes sharp as flint, stood in the doorway. She didn't speak, just looked at him with the same cautious curiosity she'd had since the alley. "There's coffee if you want some," Elias said, though he knew it was a foolish offer. She couldn't be more than 8. She shook her head and slipped past him to sit on the top step. She wrapped her arms around her knees and stared out at the land, as if measuring how far she'd have to run if she needed to. After a while, Mara appeared. She'd washed her face, though her hair was still mussed from sleep. She wore the same dress from the day before, the tear at the shoulder roughly stitched with thread Elias had given her. "This place is," she paused, scanning the view. "Big. Some days it feels bigger than others," Elias said. Her eyes flicked toward the barn, where the 2 younger girls were chasing each other around the hay bales. "They're not used to having so much room. They can run here," Elias said. "Nothing's going to come after them." Mara's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if she wanted to believe that. But belief, Elias knew, didn't come easy when life had taught you otherwise. The day moved in slow, practical motions. Elias showed Mara where the water pump was, how the stove worked, and which shelves in the pantry held the food. She didn't thank him, but she paid attention to every detail, filing it away like someone who knew survival depended on remembering. The girls explored the yard in bursts of laughter and caution, testing the distance between barn and house, climbing the fence to look at the cattle in the far pasture. Every sound they made struck Elias differently than he expected, not as an intrusion, but as a strange filling of space he hadn't realized was hollowed out. By midday, Mara was boiling beans on the stove, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. Elias watched from the doorway. She moved with efficiency, but there was no wasted energy. It was the motion of someone used to making the most of what little they had. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I know," she replied without looking at him. "But we'll need to eat." He couldn't argue with that. After they ate, the girls dozed in the shade of the porch, and Elias went to the corral to work a young colt. He could feel Mara's eyes on him from the porch, not in a way that suggested trust, but in the way one might study a man to figure out exactly how dangerous he could be. That night, the ranch settled into a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't the hollow quiet Elias had known where. The wind was the only company, and the creak of the boards under his boots was the only conversation. This silence was layered. It held the soft breathing of the girls in the next room, the faint rustle of blankets as Mara shifted in her bed, the warm crackle of the fire dying in the stove. Lying in his own bed, Elias stared at the ceiling. He told himself they'd only stay a short while, long enough for Tom Berenger to lose interest or move on to another fight. But a part of him, one he didn't care to examine too closely, already knew that wasn't true. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like something waking up. The next few days settled into a rhythm, though it wasn't exactly a comfortable one. Elias worked the cattle and kept to his usual chores, fixing the sagging stretch of fence along the north pasture, hauling water to the troughs, checking the windmill. Mara took to the kitchen without asking, cooking meals from what little was in the pantry. She didn't ask where anything came from or how long she was expected to stay. And Elias didn't ask about her life before the alley, but silence can be its own language. When Elias came in for dinner one evening, he found Mara at the table, sewing a tear in one of the girls' dresses by lamplight. Her hands moved with quick, practiced precision, but her eyes tracked him as he crossed the room, every movement of his body noted and filed away. "You don't have to fix that right now," he said, setting his hat on the peg by the door. "If I don't, it'll tear worse," she replied without looking up. He nodded, pouring himself a tin cup of water. "You could have asked me to take you into town for supplies." "Don't need town for a needle and thread," she said. Elias leaned against the wall, studying her in the lamplight. There was nothing meek about her. She might have been cornered in that alley, but she wasn't a woman who lived on her knees. The oldest girl, seated beside her mother, glanced between them like she was following a card game she didn't yet understand. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Mara stayed by the stove, wiping down the table. Elias sat in his chair near the fire, mending a strap on his saddle. The only sounds were the soft scrape of the cloth on wood and the creak of leather under his hands. "You plan on keeping us here?" she asked finally. Elias didn't look up from his work. "Not if you don't want to be here." "And if I say I want to leave?" "Then I'll take you as far as you want to go," he said. "But I won't take you back to him." Her head turned slightly at that. "So you get to decide where I can go?" He met her gaze now, steady. "No, I decide. Where I won't take you, that's different." She studied him for a moment, then looked away. "Feels about the same from where I'm standing." Elias let the silence settle again. She wasn't wrong what he called protection. She might see as control. But he also knew there were men in the territory who'd see her as fair game the chimney. Moment she set foot in town without a claim beside her. The next morning, Mara surprised him. He found her in the corral with the girls, holding the roan's reins while the middle one sat awkwardly in the saddle. Elias opened his mouth to tell her it wasn't safe, but she beat him to it. "She's got to learn sometime," Mara said. Her voice calm but firm. "I know how to hold the reins." Elias approached slowly, watching the way her hands were placed solid, not tentative. "You've ridden before." "A long time ago," she said. "Before." She stopped there, the rest unsaid. The roan flicked his ears but didn't shy. Elias gave a single nod. "Keep your heels down. And don't let her lean too far forward." Mara's eyes flickered with something, maybe surprise that he wasn't taking the reins from her. Maybe relief. Later that day, she made cornbread. The first smell of fresh baking in the house in years. Elias didn't say a word about it, but he ate 2 slices at supper, and Mara noticed. She didn't comment, just wrapped the rest in a cloth for the morning. They didn't talk much, but the air between them shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways. Mara no longer stood every time he entered a room. Elias no longer felt the need to explain where he was going every time he stepped outside. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something that looked like the start of it. At night, he could hear the girls' muffled giggles through the thin wall, and sometimes Mora's low voice telling them a story. Elias would lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't in years, the strange, disorienting comfort of knowing someone else was under his roof. But just as quickly as that comfort settled in, another thought would follow: the memory of Tom Beringer's face in the alley, red with rage and humiliation. Men like Tom didn't forget. And they didn't forgive. It was the sound of hooves that broke the late morning quiet. Not the easy, unhurried pace of a neighbor dropping by, but the steady, deliberate rhythm of men riding with purpose. Elias was in the yard, splitting wood, when he heard it, 3 horses, coming fast enough to kick up a trail of dust that shimmered in the sunlight. He set the axe down and stepped into the shadow of the porch, eyes narrowing against the glare. They came into view a moment later, Tom Beringer in front, jaws set and eyes locked on the house, flanked by the same 2 men who'd been with him in town. All 3 wore their pistols low and easy, hands just close enough to make their intent clear. Mara appeared in the doorway behind Elias, drying her hands on a dishcloth. She froze when she saw them, the color draining from her face. Without taking her eyes off the riders, she said quietly, "The girls are in the barn." "Keep them there," Elias said, his voice low but firm. Tom reined in a dozen yards from the porch. "Boone," he called, his tone mocking. "Heard you've been keeping my wife real comfortable out here." "She's not your wife anymore," Elias said. Tom's eyes narrowed. "Says who?" "Me," Elias replied, "and her." The tall man beside Tom gave a short laugh. "Last I checked, marriage don't end just 'cause some cowboy says so." Elias stepped off the porch, slow and deliberate, the boards creaking under his boots. He stopped just shy of the sunlight, his shadow stretching long in the dust. "She's not going back with you, Tom. You can turn around now and save yourself some trouble." Tom swung his leg over and slid down from the saddle. "Trouble's all yours, Boone. You embarrassed me in front of half the damn town. Nobody forgets that." The 2 other men dismounted, fanning out a little, their eyes sharp. Elias kept his own gaze fixed on Tom, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mara shift, one hand gripping the doorframe. He didn't need to look at her to know she was ready to slam the door shut. "If things turned, you don't want this fight," Elias said evenly. "Not here. Not in front of her kids." Tom's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if it had held any warmth. "Her kids," he repeated. "My kids, Boone, my blood." "They're not yours if you treat 'em like you did that night," Elias said. His tone stayed calm, but inside he could feel the slow coil of anger tightening. Tom's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. The tall man mirrored the move. "Careful," Elias warned. The moment stretched, the air thick with the smell of dust and horse sweat. A crow cawed somewhere far off, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Finally, Tom took his hand off the pistol grip, but only to point it at Mara. "You think you can hide out here forever? He can't watch you every second. We'll be back." Elias stepped forward, closing the space between them until they were nearly chest to chest. "You show up here again, and you won't ride away." Tom's eyes flicked to the revolver holstered at Elias's side. "You sure you're fast enough to back that up?" "Sure enough," Elias said. Tom stared at him for another long moment, then turned and swung back into the saddle. "This ain't over," he said, his voice carrying over his shoulder as the 3 of them wheeled their horses and rode off. The way they'd come. Elias stood there watching the dust trail fade into the horizon until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind. Mara stepped out onto the porch. "They'll come back." "I know," Elias said. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "Then we'd better be ready." Elias met her eyes. For the first time since the alley, he saw something there besides caution, something that looked a lot like resolve. The day they came back was hotter than any so far that summer. Heat shimmered off the dirt road, and the air was so still it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Elias had been mending a gate in the south pasture when he spotted the dust plume rising on the northern horizon. This time, Tom didn't ride alone. There were 4 men with him, different faces than before, but the same hard expressions. All of them armed. Elias walked back to the house with a steady pace, not hurrying, not showing what he felt. Inside, Mara was at the table with the girls, slicing bread. She stopped mid-motion when she saw his face. "They're here?" she asked. "They're coming," he said. "Get the girls in the back room. Keep the rifle close, but don't fire unless you have to." Mara hesitated. "Elias, go," he said, his voice sharper than he meant. She didn't argue again. By the time the riders reached the yard, Elias was standing on the porch, his rifle resting across his arms. The men drew up in a line, their horses snorting and stamping at the heat. Tom pushed his hat back and looked Elias over like a man sizing up a steer before the slaughter. "You had your warning," he said. "And?" "You had yours," Elias replied. Tom swung down from his horse, boots hitting the ground with a thud. "Step aside." Elias didn't move. "You're not taking her." "Not today, not ever." One of Tom's men, a lean, narrow-eyed rider with a scar down his cheek, grinned and spat into the dirt. "You really think you can stand off 5 of U.S., Boone?" Elias shifted the rifle in his hands, the barrel pointing low but ready. "I don't need to stand off 5. Just the first one stupid enough to cross that line." With the toe of his boot, he dragged a long mark in the dust between them. The sound was faint, almost delicate, but it cut through the stillness like the snap of a dry twig. "That's it," Elias said. "You step over, you don't step back." The men glanced at each other. Nobody spoke for a moment. Somewhere behind him, Elias heard the faint creak of the house's back door. Mara making sure the girls were hidden, maybe taking up her position. With the rifle, Tom's gaze dropped to the line, then came back up to meet Elias's. "You got no right." "I've got all the right I need," Elias said. Scarface nudged his horse forward, just enough to let one hoof land over the mark. The sound of hoof on hardpan was loud in the quiet. Elias's rifle came up smooth and quick, the hammer cocking with a clean click. "That's far enough," Elias said. The rider froze, his grin fading. For a long second no one moved. Then, slowly, he backed his horse until the hoof lifted off the line. Tom's mouth twisted. "You won't pull that trigger. You willing to bet your life on it?" Elias asked. Something passed over Tom's face, then anger, sure, but also a flicker of doubt. He wasn't used to men standing in his way without flinching. "One of?" The other riders muttered, "Tom, we're not getting paid enough for this." Tom's jaw worked like he was chewing rocks, but finally he spat into the dirt, turned, and swung back into the saddle. "This ain't the end, Boone. You hear me?" "Clear enough," Elias said. The men wheeled their horses and rode off, dust rising behind them until they disappeared into the horizon. Elias stayed on the porch a long moment, watching the place. Where they'd vanished, the heat making the air dance. When Mara came out, the rifle still in her hands, she didn't ask what happened. She'd heard enough from inside. She looked at the line in the dust, still sharp under the noon sun. "They'll try again," she said. "Maybe," Elias said, lowering his rifle. "But they'll remember that line." Mara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. There was no gratitude in it, no relief, just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who understood that survival didn't come from hope alone. The days after the standoff felt different. Not quieter exactly, but steadier, like the house itself had shifted onto new foundations. The girls came out of the back room that afternoon and went straight to the corral, as if testing whether the world was safe again. Mara didn't scold them for running barefoot in the dust. She just watched from the porch, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Elias kept to his chores, though he moved with a certain measured pace now, scanning the tree line more often, pausing to listen when the wind shifted. It wasn't paranoia, just a man who knew the kind of grudges some men carried, and how long they could last. One evening, as the sun bled down behind the hills, Mara came out to where Elias was oiling the hinges on the barn door. She held 2 tin cups of coffee, steam curling into the cooling air. "You've got it in your head they'll come back," she said, handing him one. "They might," he answered. "And if they do?" Elias sipped the coffee, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue before answering. "We'll deal with it same as before." Lying in the dust, rifle in hand. Mara's mouth curved into something close to a smile, though it didn't quite make it to her eyes. "That a promise?" "Better than a promise," he said. "It's how I live." They stood there a while in companionable quiet, the clink of tin against tin marking each sip. Somewhere behind them, the girls' laughter floated from the house. It was the first time since they'd arrived that Elias realized the sound didn't feel out of place. The changes came in small ways first. Mara began planting herbs and a few hardy vegetables near the kitchen window. Elias found himself leaving the door unlatched when he went out to the fields, something he hadn't done in years. The girls claimed the loft and the barn as their secret place, stringing up scraps of fabric for curtains, hanging little treasures they found in the pasture feathers, smooth stones, rusted bits of metal polished to a shine. One morning Elias returned from checking the herd to find a loaf of bread cooling on the windowsill and Mara humming softly over the wash basin. He didn't recognize the tune, but it had the sound of something older than her marriage to Beringer, older maybe than this life she was living now. It wasn't softness she was bringing into the house. It was something harder, something that could stand. About 2 weeks after Tom's last visit, Elias took the wagon into town for supplies. He saw no sign of Tom or his men, though a few folks on the boardwalk gave him long looks, the kind that carry more questions than they'll ever ask out loud. At the mercantile, old Mrs. Riggins leaned over the counter as he paid for flour and lamp oil. "You keepin' trouble on your side of the fence, Boone?" she asked. "Best I can," he said. She murmured, giving him that narrow-eyed squint she reserved for men she couldn't quite figure. "That woman and those girls good. Folks ought to stick close to 'em." He didn't answer, but her words followed him all the way back up the dusty road to the ranch. That night, Mara served venison stew and biscuits. The girls chattered over each other about some calf they'd seen in the pasture, and Elias let himself listen without thinking about Beringer or his men. After supper, he stepped outside and found Mara leaning against the porch rail, arms folded, looking out toward the dark line of the hills. "Still watching for them?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not tonight." Elias joined her, resting his elbows on the rail. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. "You could leave, you know," he said after a while. "I'd take you as far as you want." Mara didn't look at him. "We could," she said, "but I think we've already gone far enough." Elias studied her profile in the dim light. She wasn't smiling, but there was a kind of peace in her face he hadn't seen before. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was far enough. By the time they went inside, the house was warm with lamplight. The girls curled together under a quilt, the door shut against the night. Outside, the prairie stretched away into darkness, carrying whatever dangers might still be out there. Inside, it wasn't perfect, not safe in the way fairy tales promise, but it was theirs. And for now, that was enough.